20th of March, the prosecutors in Munich had a press conference and giving a lot of information about this case of blood doping. And I want to point out here, this medical doctor is still in jail. So that means we have some of those backers in jail since February here. On May 2019, our organization initiated a hearing against the former speed skater, and this is in front of an arbitration panel because this was a case before 2015 when this anti-doping law was installed. But let's have a closer look to both of those rights. And there was also a confession of a former cyclist on it. So Operation Adalas, so Adalas means bloodletting, and this was a raid in Seefeld, and maybe you remember those pictures where blood doping has performed just before the competition, on the same day of the competition, under unbelievable medical malpractice. So you see sawing of blood samples in the hotel room, and also the equipment without any hygienic background here. So the participant and athlete was caught in the act, and so this video never should have been published. So this is against the personal law here, and so I don't know whether this came out of this prosecution. 7 persons have been arrested on that day with the police in Germany and also with the police in Austria. And until today, what we know, 22 athletes from 5 different countries in 5 different sports in 8 countries are involved here. So what in Erfurt took place at the same day was in a living area. There was a garage where this medical doctor had the kind of laboratory here. So how it looked when the policemen came in. So there's a fridge at minus 80 degrees. There's also, they found more than 40 frozen blood bags in this freezer here. And also whole technique for blood doping techniques, withdrawal of blood, and also temperature control for sawing. So this is a normal procedure. This is aperture on the right side. But they also found equipment separation of erythrocytes and connection of flexible PVC tubes, all highly professional equipment here. So, but there have been other equipment in a huge amount in this garage here, and this is what the customs found all together in this raid here that was very well prepared. So, a little bit about the anti-doping law. The essential changes since 2015. This is a bundling of legal provision in one consistent law, and there's a transfer and expansion from provision from the former Medical Act here. So doping substances and methods are recorded in this act, and the prohibition of self-doping is subject to punishment. First, in top athletes who are recorded in the test pool of the National Anti-Doping Agency, or athletes achieving considerable income with the sport. And this is only a very few groups this act was made for. Maybe we have in our testing pools up to 8,000 athletes. And this is very helpful for us as a National Anti-Doping Agency. We are a foundation according to private law, and in former times it was nearly impossible for us to have exchange of information with the prosecutors, and this is also regulated in this act here, that information could be changed from both sides. Before it was in one way, when we gave a lot of information from our knowledge to the prosecutors, but nothing came back. And also data protection is an issue in Europe, in particular in Germany, and this is regulated in this Act 2 as well as arbitration proceedings, and therefore it's helpful for our work. It brought us up to another position here. So, possession is punishable from the first gram here, and also the authorization of the state governments to focus on the anti-doping criminal procedures in certain specific and specified courts by by legal regulation on it. So the cooperation, I have just mentioned it, so NADA filed a complaint against this medical doctor here too on the same day. And since February 2019 there is a constant exchange between our legal department and public prosecution in this case. But there is much more behind. This is a very necessary networking, first of all between national anti-doping agencies with our colleagues in Austria, but with our colleagues all over the world, but also with the WADA accredited labs, with their knowledge and what they might be able to analyze, and also the International Sports Federation. But within our country, so we have regular meetings with the public prosecutors, also with customs, with police, and the representatives of the two WADA accredited laboratories in Germany, and this is a very fruitful exchange of knowledge, of understanding, and this helped us much within the last 4 years. So the inspection of files in order to prepare also sports law adherence against German athletes, and as I pointed out before, there is one athlete before 2015, and this is now going to arbitration court, and this is helpful to get evidence out of those papers here. Very helpful, the whistleblower system, and we call it Sprich's an, speak up in Germany. We also got information about the whole Operation Adalas within this whistleblower system, and this was another puzzle to complete the whole picture here. But what are the consequences for us? We have to learn out of this here, and first of all we learned, so this cheating on the other side, on the dark side, they know everything what we are doing. And everything was the latest state of art of science, and that they performed this blood doping, so the reinfusion of blood, a few hours before the competition, means they were very sure that there will be low ABP tests, and this is something we have to close immediately. So it's now proportionate to take blood samples a few hours before the competition. So also medical control during drug tests, doping tests of both arms. So the athletes have huge hematoma on one arm, but they only present the clean arm to the DCO, and this is something that should be very easy just to inspect both arms to see whether there is suspicious behavior. But also the access to ABP data. So those athletes, we are in close contact with them, and we interviewed several of them. They told us it's so easy. Our ABP data are available at Adams for us within shortest time. So they use our information to beat the system, and this is something we have to think about here. The whistleblower approach has to be enhanced, very important, also the protection of whistleblowers. And we have to do comprehensive measures in prevention education, and not only for the athlete but also for the entourage, and make it mandatory for them also to be very well informed about the data. Therefore we try to find new approaches on this field too. We have to learn about. What we also learned, those cheaters don't take us serious, they don't take our system serious. The only thing they're impressed of is when the police arrested them. This is the truth, and this is something new for me. So I just want to summarize. It's the detection of an international doping crime, organized crime, by this Operation Adalas. And it was a very effective, or it is a very effective cooperation between sports and criminal law. Prevention education is needed for all target groups, and the improvement of testing never stops here, and the protection of the whistleblowers. And I hope I'm in time. Thank you very much for your kind attention. This is NADA Germany for clean competition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. Our next speaker is Peter Mattsson, Director of Sport at the Swedish Sports Confederation, who will be speaking about the path to doping-free sport is an anti-doping organization independent of sport the best choice.
Thank you, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. That's not meant to be my first slide. Let's see. There we go. And thank you to the organizers of Play the Game and the opportunity to speak at this very, very important conference. I am, as you can understand from the title, not an anti-doping officer. In fact, I'm a director of sport, but I'm still going to talk about anti-doping. And if there's one take-home message that I'd like you to bring from my presentation, it's that we, as leading figures, leading officers in sport, need to talk a lot more about anti-doping and all the ethical issues of sport that we're currently facing. Because if we don't, we're going to be facing a completely different sporting environment tomorrow than what we have seen over the last few years. The content of my presentation is that I'll start to talk a little bit about what it is that we're actually trying to fight. Of course, in this room and at this conference, and when it comes to anti-doping, what we're fighting is pretty clear. We're trying to fight doping in sport. But what I would question is that I think that we, moving forward, need to think a bit more about where we put our emphasis and whether we're actually fighting the symptom of something or the actual cause of something else. Because the ethical area of sport and the ethical issues of sport go way beyond just doping and anti-doping. And I think we in sports as a whole really have to have a good think about how we deal with those. Which brings me to the next bullet point, i.e. the role of sport. That's why I'm standing here and not an officer of the Swedish anti-doping, because I think this is an issue that sport needs to take very, very seriously, obviously. I'm going to try to explain to you a little bit about the Swedish anti-doping system, which may be, or is, actually slightly different. It's different in a way that when I speak about Swedish anti-doping is still part of the big umbrella which is Swedish sport. I know that's an issue. I know when we talk about independence that is seen to be an issue. And I'm not going to defend, but I'm going to try to explain. And explain possibly also why we think that this system has served us well in years gone by. As my last bullet point, I'm also going to talk about a few sort of suggestions on how I think we can move forward in this area. One of my inspirations in thinking about the role of anti-doping in sport and the role of doping in sport is a South African guy called Ross Tucker, or Professor Ross Tucker. One of the things that he does is a really, really good podcast. It covers a lot of areas and a lot of issues in sport. And just recently, he produced, together with a journalist that he does this podcast with, a podcast on doping and anti-doping, where he says that doping is a symptom of the system. It's not the problem of the actual athlete. I'd like to dive into that a little bit more, because I think one of the issues that we've got is that the system is owned by sport. Sport is the system. The environment in which the problems of doping, match fixing, other issues occurs is set up by sport. So where do we need to put our emphasis to try and somehow create a slightly different system that creates a slightly different outcome than the one that we're currently seeing? I think that's a question to sort of really bear in mind. One of the big discussions in terms of the ethical issues in sport lately has been the introduction of VAR, the Visual Assistant Referee, in football. And I think that again begs the question what it is we're actually trying to fight in this. Because I think what we see is that what VAR has done is that it's continued to contribute to a situation in football where football is about playing a game where the referee cannot detect that you're doing something wrong. i.e., you need to establish more and more ways to help the referee to detect whether something has been done wrongly. So we introduced VAR, and VAR has completely changed. A lot of people would say that VAR has completely changed the way football is played. One of the things that it has changed is that every match now is played up until something like 96, 97, or maybe even 98 minutes, because there's extra time that has been spent on VAR. And I think it's interesting to have a think about, what if we spent all that effort on working with the players and the system where we've already agreed that the way we play football is according to the rules. We've established a set of rules, and yet we need so many different systems, so many different instruments to try and help the referee so that he or she can detect whether something has been done wrongly and in breach of those rules. That's, I think, is an interesting issue that we've created and an interesting issue that we're facing. So what are the values and beliefs of such a system? Again, the first and foremost value of football, the way it's played and the way it's been established, shouldn't that be that when we play football according to the rules of football? My background is elite performance sport. I was a director of coaching and a head coach for the Swedish Golf Federation for a number of years and the English Golf Union for a number of years. One of the things, the really special things in golf, is that you're your own referee, at least when we play the game recreationally. If you watch a PGA Tour or a European Tour or an LPGA Tour event, it looks slightly different. Because even in those circumstances, or under those circumstances, the game has developed into something where if you're not helped by a referee, or if a referee is not there to watch over you, there's a risk that you'll break the rules. But when you play recreational golf, the whole game is built upon the fact that we actually play according to the rules. Otherwise, the game becomes completely irrelevant. If I play by the rules and I play against somebody who doesn't play by the rules, then we're not competing in a level playing field. And you all know that. But what are the values and principles that we'd like to run through our system of sport? Well, in Sweden, we've got 4 fairly simple principles, fairly simple values that run through sport as a whole. We participate in sport because of the fun and the enjoyment of it. We participate in sport because of the fellowship and the friendship that it develops. We participate in sport in a way where we run a democracy, where people that are involved in sport have a right to speak, where their voices are heard, no matter if they're young or old, if they're a boy or a girl, a man or a woman, a foreigner or a Swede. If you're involved in sport, you're involved in a democracy. That's one of the reasons to why the Swedish government is actually spending quite a lot of money on sport. Because it's a way to teach people how a democracy is run. We believe that everyone should have the right to participate in sport. That doesn't mean that everybody can play for the highest ranked team in every match. Of course not. But everybody can be a member of a sports club. And there should be a sport and a nearby sports club for everyone. No matter age, no matter background, no matter socioeconomic status, no matter color, no matter gender, there's a sports club that you can become a member of. And the last one, possibly the most important one, we play by the rules. And to learn to play by the rules starts from day one. And if we can start that from day one, is there a chance, is there an opportunity that even the player who competes for a world championship or an Olympic medal or a European championship or whatever championship that might be will still play by the rules? I would argue, yes, there is. There's no guarantee. There never is. There's a lot of opportunities there. There's a lot of lure there. But if we give up on that idea, then we're in trouble. Does anybody remember this? A long time ago, 1982, a young Swedish lad, he was 16 years old at the time, made it to the semi-finals at Roland Garros, the French Open in tennis. His name was Mattsson. He won his match, the semi-finals, he went on to the finals, and he won the finals. So he won the French Open as a 16-year-old. But what he became most famous for was not that final win. It was a point in the semi-final where Mattsson had been declared the winner of the match, although the problem was that the referee had said that a ball from his opponent was outside the line, and Mattsson had clearly seen that it actually hit the line. So he said, let's replay the ball. So the referee had to climb back again up his sort of high chair, and they replayed the ball, and Mattsson's opponent, a Frenchman, hit the ball into the net, so he won the match. But it could obviously have gone the other way. But could that be simply for the reason that Mattsson had grown up in a game, in a sport, in an environment where we play by the rules? I think so, yes. When I showed this slide to the people at our Swedish anti-doping office, they said, yes, that's a great story, but couldn't you find somebody else? Because in 1996, Mattsson tested positive for cocaine. So that's not great. That's not playing by the rules, nor the rules of sport, nor the rules of society. But it was after, at least, he had left the tennis court. Anybody remember this one? Sorry, not remember, recognize. This could be the broadest reaching Swedish news story of the year. A$AP Rocky, a rap musician, held in custody in Sweden, charged with a criminal offence. What made this story so big was obviously, first of all, it's a pretty sort of high-profile person. Secondly, there was an infamous phone call. First of all, the President of the United States wrote on Twitter that he'd spoken to his great friend, Kanye West, who said that A$AP Rocky is held in custody in Sweden. Would Mr. President be able to help out? So Mr. President calls up his very talented friend, I'm actually not sure he said that, but he said the very talented Swedish Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, just to check if there's anything that could be done. It begs the question whether the system is independent, doesn't it? Of course, this started a whole range of social media tweets and Facebook posts and everything where people from Sweden were very, very helpful in trying to educate the American president about the Swedish system. I.e., Mr. President, don't bother calling Stefan, because there's nothing Stefan can do. Because in the Swedish system, everybody, whether you're a rock star a sports person, a singer, a musician, a mathematic genius, or whatever you might be, you're treated the same way. And there's nothing any prime minister in Sweden can do about the court system, the justice system. So when Donald Trump then posts the next tweet saying that thanks to his involvement, A$AP Rocky was later on a plane home, the Swedes gently said, Mr. President, that is fake news. If we look at the Swedish justice system, here's a bit of Swedish for you. It basically starts with the government. No, sorry, it starts with the parliament. On top of it is the parliament. Then it comes down to the government. There's the Ministry of Justice, and underneath there's the authorities dealing with the actual justice system. If we change this slightly, we can see that there's obviously prison and probation, there's courts, there's police and prosecutors. If we make this into the sport, I'm going to speed up a little bit. If we make this system instead into the sporting system, there's the Swedish Sports Confederation General Assembly in the role of the Swedish Parliament. In sports, we take away the role of the government and the role of the Ministry of Justice, and we end up with this. Don't bother having a look at all of this. The important stuff when it comes to anti-doping are the red-marked boxes. There's the Swedish anti-doping, which you can see on the right-hand side is completely separate from the executive, from the board, i.e. that's where our government sit in sports. The whole of the Swedish country, the Swedish parliament, when it comes to sport, sits on top. The Swedish parliament in sport is the one that elects, it doesn't appoint, it elects the people that sit on the doping commission, it elects the people that sit on the doping board, which is the first panel that can actually judge in doping issues, and it elects the Supreme Court. So there's no appointment, and it's a system that is independent, just like the Swedish justice system is independent. The fact that it actually still sits within the parliament means that we can deal with anti-doping issues, we can deal with ethical issues at every level of our sport. Obviously, this system has its pros and cons. I would say that the pros mainly are about the chance for sport to really govern itself, to take responsibility for its own ethical issues. Sport is run in a, I would probably call it, effective way in Sweden. Our Ministry of Sport basically does not exist. It consists of two people that completely work together with the Swedish Sports Confederation to support sport and govern sport. The cons of it, obviously, yes, people may raise the question of, is there a conflict of interest? Just like you can do that in terms of being Donald Trump and making a phone call to Stefan Löfven, the Swedish Prime Minister. We have not, over the years, been particularly good to explain this system to the rest of the world. So I can understand that it can be looked upon as a system where independence is questioned. If it's part of one and the same organization, then yes, we need to be very, very clear about when Swedish anti-doping speaks. Who is it that speaks? And is that voice, has that voice got a complete freedom of speech? Lastly, I would also say that we're very aware of what is happening around the world. And maybe the most important thing is, what does athletes think? What does athletes think about the system that we support them with and the system that is supposed to support them. And what do others think about Swedish athletes that come from this structure and this background? I think one of the jobs, the really important jobs that we have in sport, is to explain how we view the values and the principle that we want to govern our sport with. That we, from day one, need to teach our athletes, boys and girls, what's right and what's wrong. We need to understand that sport organizations need to work together with NADOs, where I think one of the dangers of complete independence is that sport organizations may take a very, very laid-back position and not be enough interested in anti-doping issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And our final speaker is Faraz Shahlaei, I know I butchered that, of Loyola Law School, talking about international responsibility of states and victims of state-sponsored doping.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks everyone for being here. You might have noticed that I'm obsessed with international law and human rights. So what I'm trying to do is to maybe I can bring a new approach in this fight. So look at the issues from another perspective and see if it can be helpful or not. Since WADA investigations confirmed the state-sponsored doping program by Russia, I was so curious to see what will be the response by sport governing bodies. Since the other party in this case was in fact a state, an entity that operates on a higher level, belongs to a different hierarchy and subject to a different body of law, one over which CAS, RSC, or WADA has no powers. In 2019, WADA published a progress report in which they discussed the responses in the aftermath of this scandal. And they recognized a frustration and confusion among the stakeholders about what sanctions are needed, by which organizations, and they further acknowledged the main challenge in this case: the control exercised by government authorities on the doping program. And they expressed concern that detecting cheating in such an environment is and will always be a difficult, if not an impossible task. WADA's new approach might be helpful on lower levels, but it still offers little promise for success on the level that we are discussing right now, which involves states. In fact, it's only public international law that can bind the states from above and change domestic practices. Therefore, the question is, can we hold the states accountable based on international law for violation of doping regulations? If yes, then based on the same principles, there is a requirement for compensating the victims. The starting point for this analysis is the United Nations International Law Commission draft articles on state responsibility. Based on the draft, there are 3 requirements for holding a state accountable. First, the existence of an international obligation. Second, breach of that obligation. And third, attribution of the conduct. Let's see what's the existence of an international obligation. States bind themselves on the international level by entering into multilateral or bilateral contracts with other states. We call it in international law conventions or treaties. They also can accept obligations with respect to individuals. The main international instrument for tackling doping is the 2005 UNESCO Convention Against Doping in Sport, which is the only legally binding international instrument in this regard. It's also the second most ratified UNESCO treaty, and Russia has ratified this convention in 2006. The second document is the European Anti-Doping Convention by the Council of Europe that Russia has ratified it in 1991. These instruments call for the national legislators to adopt legal provisions in this regard and also obligate the governments to cooperate with other stakeholders in the fight against doping. Then we have the WADA Code, and although that states are not direct parties to the WADA Code, but the legal force created by the UNESCO Convention provides the code with a unique status, a document of a private nature which displays a high degree of public character. Lastly, states also have bilateral obligations on the international level. One forms of these obligations are the host city contracts between governments and sport governing bodies. Adding to the host city contracts, specifically in this case, Russian Ministry of Sport in 2006 signed a bilateral agreement with IOC accepting obligations for the application of the WADA Code and international doping standards. On the other side of the coin, states also have obligation versus individuals, emanating from multiple human rights treaties, United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, European Convention of Human Rights, International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and European Social Charter. Russia is bound by all these documents by virtue of ratification, and by this one by virtue of its position as the customary international law. And I have identified 4 prominent rights for individual athletes that have been violated by this doping program. The right to health, the right to bodily integrity, the right to just and favorable working conditions, and the right to safe and healthy conditions of work. Now that we saw Russia not only had one, but multiple international obligations in this regard, the next step is to see if there was in fact a breach of these obligations. 2 WADA reports count a number of measures that are egregious violation of the provisions of the documents that we discussed previously. In the words of the independent investigator, these facts have been established beyond a reasonable doubt. Furthermore, the whole doping program also defeats the purpose and the spirit of the international obligations that Russia had. Together, the existence of an international obligation and a breach of those obligations constitute an international wrongful act. Now let me clear the last obstacle and see if this international wrongful act is in fact attributable to the state. Challenge usually arises when states are acting through proxies, non-state actors, where it's hard to establish a link between them and the government structure. But when they are acting through their own agents, then it's very straight to the point. For the purpose of international responsibility, the state is a single entity. It doesn't matter if the violator is a high-ranking official or very low in the structure of the government. In this case, the Ministry of Sport, Deputy Minister, Intelligence Services. It doesn't matter if the violator is a part of judiciary, executive, or legislative. It doesn't matter if they were acting beyond the scope of their powers or they were acting under orders. More importantly, it doesn't matter if the violation is intentional or unintentional. In other words, fault is not a requirement. As soon as we have an international wrongful act attributable to the state, then there is a requirement for compensating the victims. But who are the victims in this case? States? Potentially. Sport governing bodies? Potentially. But international law has recognized that the subject of a right to reparation is an individual. The International Law Commission draft also mentions that individuals concerned should be regarded as the ultimate beneficiaries and, in that sense, as the holders of the relevant rights. The centrality of the athletes as the primary beneficiaries of the anti-doping framework is undeniable. Therefore, athletes turn into subject of compensation in this case and should be compensated for both material and moral damages. Material damage includes actual damages like rewards and bonuses, or lost earnings like sponsorships and endorsements. But the thing that is more important here is the moral damages, if you review the jurisprudence of the international courts might even exceed the amount of material damages. And the reason is that at the end, money is an imperfect substitute for such a loss. No amount of money can compensate the moment of glory that an athlete turns into a hero and wins the hearts of millions of people. The last piece of this puzzle is that, okay, now that we have established responsibility and a requirement for compensation, where can we go to get the money? International Court of Justice or European Court of Human Rights are two forums that right from now are potentially competent to rule on this case. However, for going in front of the International Court of Justice, there is a stronger need for a political will on behalf of the governments to provide the athletes with diplomatic protection to be able to go in front of the court. European Court of Human Rights is a more plausible option. First, Russia has accepted the jurisdiction of the court. Second, individuals can raise direct claims against the states in this court. Court of Arbitration for Sports at this moment doesn't have jurisdiction on this case, but it might be a favorable option. It depends on the future of the CAS, a reform in the structure, and a review of the arbitration clause to waive the immunity of the states in front of the court. So to conclude, we saw that where there is a huge power imbalance between sport governing bodies and sovereign states, international law can help to close the gap. We need to guarantee that states cannot buy international prestige and ruin the career of the clean athletes and at the end run away with little or no cost. They have to pay the price. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Faraz. We now have time for questions from the audience. The gentleman with the mic is right behind you.
Good to hear my name. I'm from Ireland. I just have a question and an observation. The question is, what's going to happen to the doctor involved in Andrea's case? What's likely to be the outcome for him? And also, when you look back at practically every major doping scandal, you'll find the doctor intimately involved. And what has been the outcome for them over the years as well? And I say this as a doctor.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I guess it's the first time that a medical doctor has been imprisoned with such a huge doping case here. So we never had it before in Germany, and there have been several cases before. And only with this act we do have the possibility to do so. And I guess to be in jail since February also gives an idea what could be the outcome afterwards. It goes to court, but it's still an ongoing investigation, and there is so much evidence to evaluate that they need more and more time. And I guess this is the only way to get the people in the back, and we know there is a science behind. Science on the other side to find exactly the holes and the gaps where our system is not working 100%. And this we have to keep an eye on and to get this, and this kind of organized crime, so it's impossible with our measures we have on a daily basis, and there we need the support of the prosecutors, so with telephone hearing, with house searching, and to gain those evidence what an international crime network is using nowadays. Thank you.
Michael had a question.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Michael Ask. I'm the CEO of Anti-Doping Denmark. And first of all, thank you for some very interesting presentations. To all of you, that was really, really interesting to different perspectives. My questions go to Peter. And allow me to give a short comment first before short enough. Just to say that I totally agree with you. You talked about education and playing by the rules and these values that I think also the anti-doping movements in general, we have learned over the past years that is actually where we can change the behavior in the long term. And that's also why I think generally we agree around the world in the anti-doping organizations that now we will have a standard on education, which is highly, highly needed. But back to your presentations and your explanation about the Swedish system. Of course, I will have to challenge you a little bit about it because you mentioned the Swedish justice system, which I think is what we would call the tripartition of powers, which is, with all due respect to the Swedish society and Sweden in general, which is a country I highly like and have had the pleasure of visiting countless times. It's nothing special Swedish. I think it goes for most democratic countries. And as we learned this morning by the president of the Danish Football Association, it was Montesquieu back in the 18th century who invented that. And that's also why I think, going back to your anti-doping system, that I agree you have a totally independent doping panel, so that will be the judicial system. But it seems to me that the other two parts of the tripartition, the legislative and the executive branch, are a little bit mixed together in Sweden. And I have no reason to believe that you're not able to handle those conflict of interest. But there is, in my opinion, at least a perceived conflict of interest, which you also mentioned, to be fair to you. But how, so now to my question, so how do you ensure that those two branches are not mixed up, especially if, let's say, you have, you would figure out that you have some problems in some sports in Sweden, and the branch that should, the executive branch, the anti-doping organization is supposed to investigate it. So that's the mix there. And the other question is about the budget. How do you secure, let's say, sufficient budget for your anti-doping organization, which is not, let's say, controlled by the sports federation?
Yes. Thank you, Michael. I did have a feeling that you might ask questions similar to those, and thank you for that. I think, to begin with, I would say that one of the issues with independence is that it is very rarely a question of yes or no. It has a spectrum. It goes from sort of being completely dependent to somewhere over here being completely independent. And I don't think there's any system in the world that can reach over here, because somebody has to provide funding, somebody has to be some sort of an overarching, whether that's like whether we like it or not, we're different nationalities. And can we then be completely independent? I think that is an issue to sort of really have a think about. So what I think that we can do within our system, as it is right now, is to move to greater independence. And I think we're getting some help from the new 25(1) part of the code, where yes, we will need to establish a complete sort of conflict of interest declaration. We will need to look upon who is sort of possible to elect for boards and for doping commissions and so forth. What we still will have to face is the perceived conflict of interest, as you say. And I don't have a clear answer for that. I think, again, where I would start is that unless we have a mutual agreement between sport and the anti-doping organizations about what kind of sport we want to be able to participate in, then no independence in the world will be able to save this problem for us, or solve this problem for us.
I think lady in the back in the middle has a mic.
Yeah, got it. Everybody hear me?
Now, better? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, Jill Yesko. Thank you to all the panelists for your very compelling presentations. I want to address this especially to Andrea and to Peter. I directed a documentary called Tainted Blood, which is a deep dive into the 1984 blood doping scandal at the Los Angeles Olympics, which some of you may recall. 8 members of the U.S. cycling team blood dope, non-autologists. They used other people's blood, and very mixed results. Some athletes got quite ill. What was interesting was, at that time, blood doping was not officially illegal, even though what was then the governing body for United States cycling told them not to do it. The head coach, who had come over from Poland, was one of the people who assisted in orchestrating this. In interviews with the athletes afterwards, it came out, and incidentally, none of the athletes agreed to be on camera, even though it was many, many years later. I thought they would want to at least present their side of the story, but they said, you know, we really saw nothing wrong with it. The '84 Olympics were really interesting. You know, as you know, it was a boycott Olympics, and to your point, Peter, what came out of it was this ethos of win at all costs. I find it very interesting that we're at a conference called Play the Game, not win the game, not game the game. And I'm wondering if you might, you or Andrea might comment on this. Thank you.
Andrea?
So thank you very much. So first of all, I guess so there is a development also on the side of dopers, and if we go back to the 80s within the last century, so we have seen there was blood doping with the same blood group but from a different person. So then EPO became available, and there was a shift to EPO because it was much easier to cheat and to use this. And it took us another 10 years to get a detection method for it. And then we saw EPO misuse was detectable, and it went back to blood doping again. And then there have been possibilities to detect the homologous blood transfusion, so same blood group from another person, and it goes back to the autologous blood. So there's always a moving, so the doping effort is a moving target for me. And so on the other hand, it shows us that we closed many, many doors. What's not possible nowadays to do and how to cheat, and what kind of effort had to do on the day of the competition. As a former athlete, I cannot imagine to do such a treatment by myself only a few hours or before the competition, and what they did afterwards to underwent the doping test, drinking salted water and whatever. So we give it anyhow a hard time to manipulate, but the game is going on, and therefore though athletes, especially within Germany, on the western part of Europe, are very well treated in our education and prevention lessons. So it's not like the former 80s, nobody knows about it and about the health risk and whatever. And one of this outcome of the story, or the best, let me say, message of this, they are still alive. So this is male practice in blood transfusion with nicknames, ignoring any rules of good practice in transfusion medicine. And this is also something we take up. They take a high health risk and they know about it. So we were able last week in Tokyo on the US Anti-Doping Science Conference to sit on the podium with this one athlete you see over the media. So it's Max Hauke, his name, and he told his story. and it was very impressive for all of us, and also my colleague from Austria. And we asked the question, the only thing they fear is the police, and they feel so strong in their system, they know in detail how to apply everything. They were really taught by the medical staff and the doctors also in abusing the growth hormone. And this is something we have to take into account. This kind of professionalism, and on the other hand, we need the same professional persons and people to support us as a national anti-doping agencies in our day-to-day work, and with the prosecutors and with the help of the law to prevent young athletes to go in such a high risk.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's why you need a biochemist working alongside sports, because I think that the question has a historical background, and I think one of the issues is that, as I said, my background is from golf, and in golf we still have amateur golf and professional golf, and the main reason I would say to why amateur golf or amateur sports as a whole existed in the first place was that that was the only way to keep sport clean. At least that is what we thought. I.e. when the lure of the dollar walks in, then out goes the idea to play by the rules. The only problem is that even in amateur golf and amateur sport, there's so many other ways to remunerate athletes and coaches and so forth, so you still have the same problem. I would argue that what we need is a leadership that is prepared to stand up for the acceptance of the rule and the idea that we all actually play by the rules. We play the game according to the rules and nothing else is accepted, which is difficult, but it's the only way.
Maybe there's something I would like to add here, so what we learned from Max Hauke, that there's a whole environment that's talking and knowing about doping. So when young athletes come into those training camps where the older ones are practicing, where the coaches are, so it's not unknown. He talks about maybe toxic talking. And this was something the youngsters are so much influenced by the older ones, and there is still philosophy and a tradition of doping, because there are people, coaches, trainers, officials being in this business for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And we have to break this. And this is, I guess, the most important point, to get an environment for young athletes where they really believe in clean sport and they are supported in their beliefs and in their ethics and their moral beliefs.
I know Andy has a question.
Yes, is this working? I can shout out.
You can shout loud enough.
It's Andy Brown from the Sports Integrity Initiative. I was struck by, Peter, your presentation, sort of the focus on the spirits of sport, and it struck me that in Alberto Salazar, we were dealing with somebody who'd run himself unconscious, who had developed severe mental issues, actually, in terms of running when he was injured, and had become addicted to running. And in my opinion, we sort of have the wrong people involved in coaching athletes. And I wondered how your vision in Sweden of getting the right people in the right jobs, how we can apply that internationally when there's so much focus on winning at all costs in many other countries. I'm not just talking about the Western world, but Kenya, Asia, etc., where regulation is less, etc. So that was the first part of my question. The second part, I'll be very quick, because I just wondered, Faraz, if you'd had any success with bringing any cases forward with your system, which was very, very interesting. Thank you for that.
We'll let Peter go first briefly, and then for us.
Yeah, I think, thank you. That is $1 million question that you are posing, and I think the issues of bad coaching, maltreatment, and so forth is not just in anti-doping or in doping issues. We see it in I mean, look at the situation we had with the US gymnastics team and the harassment and the abuse that young boys and girls are put through simply because there's a system and there's a coach there that think that they can become the greatest thing since sliced bread in sports. And that is a long-term job that we need to look after. I think in all these issues, there's somebody sits with a very, very strong sort of card on their hands, and that's whoever gets the funding. Pull funding and changes will come. And I think the people that give funding to sport need to really consider that. And we, within sport, that sort of in our term, provide funding or disperse funding, need to be clear what we are providing funding for and what kind of environment we want to put that funding in. That it's a difficult job, but it has to be done.
Faraz.
Thanks for your question. One thing that I realized in this conference since yesterday was that we always have a dead end. How can we get the sport governing bodies to respond? How can we hold them accountable? How can we question them? They don't appear anywhere. They don't have any willing to do that. So we have an International Human Rights Center at Loyola Law School. We have successfully litigated in front of multiple international human rights courts and commissions in the United States, in the Inter-American region, and in Europe. I joined them this year. So starting from this year, we started working on the interaction between sports and human rights. I'm not aware of any cases that have been brought so far, probably because nobody is aware that we have these venues available. I asked a couple of questions in the previous forums. There were no answers for it because probably nobody knows that we have these international mechanisms and they are working. So what we are doing there, we have already started drafting a submission against the state. Which one of the most important international federations is headquartered in the territory of that state? So based on a range of human rights obligations and international obligations, we are going to hold that state under pressure that these things are happening in the realm of that international federation, which is headquartered in your territory. And based on these international obligations, you have responsibility to guarantee the respect for all your international obligations and international human rights norms. So we have already started the process. We are working also on an individual case about state-sponsored doping, which has violated the right to health and bodily integrity under the mandate of the European Convention of Human Rights. We are still working on that. We might bring a case in that specific matter, but we have started this process. We are going to use the international mechanisms in force that largely has been ignored by all the stakeholders in sports. Keep an eye on it. Good news will come out. And in the meantime, I want to invite all the stakeholders to come up with any type of information or cases that can help us to frame this debate and present it in a better structure. Thank you.
Thank you, Faraz. And thank all of our speakers today for their time. And thank you for attending our panel. This concludes the panel, and hope you enjoy your lunch.